Hello and welcome to Friday Reading. Well, it usually starts that way in a horror story, and if you've heard my reading of Bram Stoker's The Judge's House, it certainly does get stormy and scary. But for the next few Fridays, I'm going to be reading Obsidian Murders, Book 1 of the Midnight Detective Agency, written and published by Nicole Brona. A big thank you to Nicole for allowing me to read her amazing work. And Obsidian Murders is urban fantasy, even though I keep saying it's fun horror because we have so many different creatures and events going on. But it is urban fantasy. If you enjoy immersive reading, be sure to go grab your copy of Obsidian Murders. If you don't have one yet, pause the video here. You can find out where to purchase Nicole's work on her channel page, Nicole's Bookish Nook, or you can find her on Amazon. Now, from this point on, the background is going to be different because I recorded this the other day, and for some reason, my silly laptop messed up the audio. Chapter 1, Bethesda, Maryland. I drum my fingers against the side of the desk, trying to keep my eyes off the office fairy that was dragging a set of keys under the chair, psting at me to get my attention. I sucked in a deep breath and plastered a fake, toothy grin across my face as Rebecca Anderson, my boss, breezed past me and sat in her high-backed chair with a smile. This was my second performance review at the Bethesda newspaper, but I wasn't nervous. I'm good at my administrative assistant job, even though it sucks. Tedious, boring, and it didn't take up a lot of brain power. I often finished work early and had to pretend I had another 2 hours worth of work to do. The job was so easy, I couldn't complain except for two minor details, one of which was Drussel, the office fairy, who expected nothing less than perfect cleanliness, which I usually agree with if you're working in an office building with horrible ventilation and sweaty bodies, but not now. His hissing and pouting had to end. Bethesda, Maryland was once a small city for anyone that didn't want to live in Washington, D.C., but had no issue commuting until a sudden burst of wealth drew flocks of people to work in and around the metropolitan area. That included me. Now, 12 years later, the small city's population was pushing triple digits. The people who flocked to the city were rich, minus a few concessions. I was one of those concessions. I graduated a year ago with a BA in journalism from Salem State University and barely earned enough to make rent each month. Which is minor detail number 2. I had a journalism degree working for a local newspaper in an ever-growing city, but I could only manage an administrative job because of my lack of experience. Or so Rebecca explained when she hired me a year ago. That had to be different since it's been a year, right? Right. To give her some credit, she doesn't own the newspaper, but she could give me a few pieces. I was able to write 7 articles about small businesses opening, and I interviewed a local skateboarding club that met on the weekends that picked up trash around the city. But that's not enough for me. So my smile grew wider and I nodded reverently as Rebecca rattled off the usual, "You're doing so well," and "We love your writing," while ignoring the fairy who was untying my shoelaces. It'd do nothing for me professionally or personally to deal with the fairy in question in front of my boss. I learned as a child that whenever I said I could see other beings, or as the vast majority of the population would say, mythical creatures, I'd be deemed crazy. and I had been, in fact, deemed crazy by numerous teachers in elementary school. I was shunned, bullied, and harassed. They even made me see a therapist twice a week for hallucinations before my parents moved to Salem, Massachusetts when I was 13 years old. It was a learning experience to say the least. After that, I never told another soul about my magical ability, aside from several local Salem covens. I started to bop my foot, trying to rid myself of the fairy, but he grabbed hold of the flaps of my black high-top Converse and held on as if he were at a Texas rodeo. "So, what do you think?" Rebecca asked, leaning forward with interest. I blushed, realizing I hadn't been paying attention. I cleared my throat before asking, "Just before I agree, can you explain it to me again?" Rebecca rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair. "I want you to take over the advice and gossip column for Jolene. The questions related to online dating and ghosting, whatever that means, frustrates and confuses her, and she has no idea about the latest Hollywood gossip. Also, because she's retiring in 2 months and you found no one to replace her." "Yes, that too, but it works out, doesn't it? You get a $5,000 raise, 2 weeks paid vacation, and a 401k, Rebecca explained with a little too much excitement. I shifted in my seat. A $5,000 raise and the added benefits would help immensely, but it wasn't a legitimate journalism job like we talked about a few weeks ago. I didn't spend thousands of dollars on a journalism degree to run an advice and gossip column, Rebecca. I told you during my original job interview I want to be a full-time journalist. I knew from the start that I had to work up to it, and honestly, I'd rather do that than run a gossip and advice column." Rebecca waved away my concerns. "You think someone fresh out of college would be this lucky? Anyone your age would jump at this opportunity." "All my friends have actual journalism jobs." "Do they live with 5 other people in a one-bedroom apartment and can only afford wax-coated ramen noodles?" Rebecca countered. "Well, yes, but they're doing what they love and—" "Please, not this again." Rebecca pressed her fingers against her temples and shook her head. "I came to you first because I didn't want to go through the process of hiring someone from scratch when I have you, a fantastic writer with heart and empathy, and someone young enough that knows what ghosting means," I added. Rebecca glared at me. "Yes, indeed." She paused for a moment, her fingers running across her keyboard. I knew she was about to say something important, but a staffer knocked on the office door before Rebecca could speak. "Stay here, we aren't done yet," Rebecca said before she scurried out the door. When my boss and the staffer were out of sight, I gritted my teeth, swung my head under the desk, and plucked the fairy from my shoe. He squirmed in my grasp and squeaked in fake terror. I rolled my eyes so far back into my head I saw Jesus and plopped the fairy onto my lap. "What is your problem now, Drussel?" Drussel puffed up his chest. "Lucinda keeps leaving trash under her desk and refuses to clean it up. Do you know how revolting it smells under there?" "And taking her keys will do what?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "House fairies, or office fairies if they're in an office setting, would steal items and hide them to teach humans a lesson. But unless you knew about fairies, there was no lesson learned. She needs to learn how to clean up after herself." "We've had this discussion, Drussel. How will anyone in this building know they're being punished when you hide something from them? They can't see you. Only I can." "Why can't you say something for me then? Please?" Drussel asked meekly, his cheeks burning red. "Why don't you tell Lucinda? I bet she'll be ecstatic to see a house fairy randomly appear before her and go off about her organizational problems. I don't like your tone, Drusel muttered. His eyes were flashing from hazel to black as he growled at me in frustration. I poked his beer belly. He screeched and wrapped his arm around his torso, trying to protect his stomach from another poke, but his eyes went back to his normal hazel color and his cheeks deflated. That was just plain rude, Tessa O'Hara, Drusel sputtered. When you bother me during a meeting with my boss, who can fire me at any time, yes, I'm going to be a bit rude. Please, put Lucinda's keys where you found them and find another way to get her to clean up after herself. Drusel grumbled under his breath, but nodded. I held out my hand, and he scooted out of my palm, still muttering under his breath. But with all his huffing, Drusel immediately went to haul Lucinda's key back from whence they came, now that his tantrum was over. And it was just in time. Rebecca opened her office door and closed it a moment later with a sharp slam. She winced and apologized for the noise. I nodded and sighed with relief, thankful it wasn't a passive-aggressive outburst on Rebecca's part. Rebecca smoothed her skirt under her before sitting back down. Where were we? I was going to ask if you'd be interested in running the story about the 4 high schoolers who were involved in a hit and run that I wrote up 3 weeks ago, I stated, heart hammering against my rib cage. Rebecca didn't want to run the story because the 4 high schoolers in question were the sons of diplomats who were keen on keeping the story quiet, even though the crash sent 5 people to the hospital. But I had one last chance to push for the story to be printed in the next publication. Rebecca groaned in protest before she face-palmed, and my heart fell. But I refused to show defeat or embarrassment. Instead, I shrugged, lip curling in artificial amusement. You know I had to try. And you know I can't do that. The owner of the newspaper is close with one of the diplomats, Rebecca explained in exasperation. Back to the original question. Tessa, do you want the job or not? I need an answer. I bit the inside of my cheek, the smile falling into a grimace. I needed the money and the benefits. But would this set back my career? I could already picture it in 30 years, still answering people's silly and often creepy questions for the Bethesda newspaper's advice column. Not to mention the gossip section would probably suck my soul dry. I was a journalist, not an advice and gossip columnist. I didn't want to sell myself short and be stuck for the rest of my life doing something I never would have chosen to do if not for financial issues. But on the other hand, in this economy, choosers were losers, and I rather enjoyed having a roof over my head, and food, definitely food. Yes, I'll take the job for now. I held out my hand for a handshake, which was met with a sigh of relief and slight annoyance. Chapter 2. It was dusk by the time I got off work. It was bumper-to-bumper traffic as far as the eye could see, even on the side roads. Luckily, I didn't drive to work. I'd probably flip my shit if I was stuck in traffic for hours just to get home every night. But that was the reality of working in or around Washington, D.C. I zipped up my black, knee-length coat, waved goodbye to everyone in the office, and locked the front door behind me. I knew the other journalists would be in the office until late, getting ready for the next printing, and didn't want to worry about any weirdos coming in and out of the building. Though it was already dark out, I didn't want to go home yet. I needed coffee. I could have a cup of coffee at 5 p.m. and be in bed a few hours later. Because of my obsession with coffee since I was 16, caffeine barely affected me. The taste reminded me of happiness, and I needed some happiness right about now. I turned right on Norfolk Avenue and walked for a few minutes, ignoring the blaring headlights in my vision and honking horns. then turned left onto a side street where my favorite coffee joint was located. The Caffeinated Dragon was a quaint, small shop that opened in the late 70s by Roger Walkins, a well-known horror author. Being a lover of coffee and books, he had decorated the coffee shop with thousands of books. There was no such thing as wall space in the Caffeinated Dragon. But the best part about the Caffeinated Dragon was the ability to take however many books home as you pleased, as long as you replaced them with another book. I smiled at the thought of all the authors I'd discovered thanks to such a brilliant idea, and sighed with contentment. Shaking off the chill, I opened the door and was immediately greeted by the manager of the coffee shop, Damian Williams. He was a few years older than me, with short hair, light brown eyes, and dark skin. "Do you want your usual?" he asked, already behind the register. I pursed my lips, looking at the newly updated menu for the holidays. "When does your pumpkin spice latte start back up?" "It's supposed to be available next Friday, but I can make an exception for you. Roger won't mind, just don't tell anyone." "I won't tell a soul," I replied, handing him a $5 bill. He beamed at the $2 tip and went to work on the latte. I unzipped my purse, grabbed my phone, and started looking through my unread text messages. Most of them were from my next-door neighbor, Alex, but one text message stood out. "Did your performance review go all right, sweetie?" My mom had sent it almost 6 hours ago, but I couldn't seem to respond with a simple, "Yes, it went well. They promoted me." Would have been easier to text my mom so I didn't sound so disappointed, but I had left my mom on red for too long. "Why the long face?" Damien asked, his eyebrow raised in concern. He held out the coffee mug and I took it with slight hesitation. "I left my mom's text on red for most of the day." Damien hissed in emotional pain. "Good luck with that conversation." "She must think I didn't do well and is waiting for me to call her, or she would have called on my lunch break." "Wait, you did well, but you still left her hanging?" Damien asked, confusion settling over his face. "I was promoted to a full-time advice columnist." Damien sucked in a breath. "Are the benefits good enough for you to stick around for a few years?" I shrugged. "Yes, but I just don't want to be stuck, you know? I need journalism experience to get another job, and I have little of that right now." Damien nodded, understanding my predicament. "Maybe your mom'll have some ideas. Moms always do." "Too true," I replied, and took a sip of my pumpkin spice latte. I let out an overly emotional breath and closed my eyes. So much better than all the name brands. "I'd hope so, since you spend at least $100 a month here." "I'm keeping Roger in business." "Even though you're a struggling journalist?" "The only thing I spend my money on is coffee, I swear," I replied. Damien held up his hands in defeat as he chuckled. After 2 more sips, I settled into a little crook near the classics section and dialed my mom's number. She instantly picked up. "Hello, Tessa. How did the performance review go?" Mom asked, hesitation in her voice. I sucked in a breath and let it out slowly. "I was promoted to be a full-time advice columnist." "That's good news. I know that's not what you want to do, but do you get a raise, benefits, more hours?" "All of the above. I'll be full-time instead of part-time. That means you don't have to pay half my bills next month." "We don't mind doing that for you, darling, but I'm so glad you're getting on your feet. For a 22-year-old, I think you're doing very well for yourself, and don't think you're not. I know you're thinking that right now, but you're being too hard on yourself." "I just don't want to get stuck being an advice columnist for the rest of my life," I explained, trying to hide the strain in my voice. I knew Mom meant well, but this was one of my worst fears, not being able to become a full-time journalist. and had come true a few months after I moved to Bethesda. Now, a year later, it was still an issue. That didn't seem like a good sign. Can you ask Rebecca if you can still do small journalism projects? That way you can put down advice columnist and journalist on your resume. I suggested something, and she shot it down. There was a long pause before my mom asked, "Was it the one about the diplomat's children?" I cleared my throat. "Maybe." My mom huffed into the phone. "Well, of course she turned that down. You know how the government works." "Mom, let's not get into that right now." Okay, no problem. Let's just think this out for a second." There was another pause. I chewed the inside of my cheek, waiting for my mom to come up with a miraculous plan to solve all my current problems. "How about you ask your boss to give you small journalist-related jobs here and there and gain her trust that way? She doesn't seem to like when you find stories, but whenever she gives them to you, you hit it out of the park and she loves them. Just don't tell her you found a story. Always wait for her to give them to you. It might take a while after the whole diplomat debacle." "Right, but in the meantime, keep journalist on your resume and add in advice and gossip columnist behind it. That way, it still looks like you're a journalist, and if anyone asks what you're doing, just say you're looking into the diplomat situation. And when it becomes 6 months and the diplomat thing is passed, you come up with something else, but only if Rebecca hasn't let you do small journalism pieces for the newspaper yet. If she keeps giving you pieces to work on, I wouldn't say anything." I agreed with my mom's advice with a smile, pleased. She always had the right answers. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window, sipping my coffee as my mom talked about my father's newly opened art studio. It took over a year to finish the studio because of that cement issue I mentioned over the summer, but it's bigger than the shed and it's right next to our driveway, so visitors won't park as close to the house now. Isn't that exciting? My father's a painter and writer, while my mother's a sculptor and potter. They were once art professors, but gave up their careers to move to Salem for me. I knew they didn't resent me, and not just because they always told me they didn't. They were happier and preferred living on 10 acres of land away from the city. They joined a coven of 60 members 7 years ago, all artists except a lawyer and 2 nurses, who helped them raise enough money to build a studio on their property. "Yes, it sounds very exciting. I'm assuming you have a spot in the studio for your things?" I asked, but I didn't hear her answer. I dropped my phone as I spied a vampire walking towards the coffee shop. He was covered in tattoos. The top of his left hand had a black and gray skull with empty eyes, and the top of his right hand had a black and red rose in full bloom. He also had a black and gray raven with its wings extended across his upper chest. I couldn't see the full tattoo because his shirt hid it, but it was a V-neck, so I saw enough. He had the smallest size of gauges in his earlobes, and his hair was in an undercut style. I slid down my chair, trying to hide my face, as the vampire opened the door to the shop and strode over to the counter. I shook my head and grabbed my phone from between the chair cushions. "I'm sorry, Mom. There's a vampire in the coffee shop. He's ordering an Americano." "Oh, that's such a good drink. What does he look like?" "He has a lot of tattoos." "I love men with tattoos. What kind?" "The usual. Skull and roses seem to be the dude's theme, but he has a raven on his chest, which is interesting." I trailed off, studying him as he paid for his coffee, and sat at the table closest to the door. He has dark brown hair, but it's slicked back with pomade or gel or something. It's a shame when men do that. Wait, why are you nervous about a vampire? You loved your high school librarian. What was her name? Regina? Yes, but she was a 300-year-old woman that was turned when she was at least 50. She wasn't threatening, I argued, gripping my mug until my knuckles were white. I'd never seen this vampire before, and it made me nervous. I knew about every other being in town. Wasn't hard to find them. They stuck out like a sore thumb, though to everyone else they were invisible or glamoured to look like a regular human being. Is he doing anything suspicious? Was he mean to Damien? No, nothing like that. My mom sighed with impatience. What did I tell you about stereotyping other beings, Tessa? They're almost never like how they're portrayed on television. And the vampire who was hurting people years ago, the coven took care of him with ease. I'm not stereotyping. He's new to the area, that's all. Why don't you introduce yourself? You did that with everyone else, and it worked out well. Honestly, I think you'd appreciate it. It's a surprise to find a human that has the ability to see other beings, and you don't want to frighten anyone. You know what? That's a good idea. Let me go do that right now. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Have fun and don't judge, Mum said, making kissy noises before hanging up the phone. I set my mug on the coffee table to my right, near the nonfiction section, before standing. Wiping the sweat from my palms, I put on a big smile and turned around, only to find the vampire was gone.